She'd convinced herself the new place would fix it, a second-floor apartment on a street with real neighbors, locked mailboxes, a door that didn't creak every time the wind changed direction. She'd signed the lease with trembling hands, telling herself that this was it. A clean break. No more random calls. No more shadows she couldn't explain to anyone who didn't know how to listen. The first few nights were quiet, like she'd stepped out of a storm and into a space where the world was finally gentle. She slept with her phone on silent, a new number she hadn't given to anyone but work. She stacked books under the windows just like her old therapist told her, little rituals make you feel grounded. She brewed tea and actually drank it while it was hot, instead of letting it go cold on a nightstand she barely touched. Then, 5 days after the move, she opened her mailbox and saw it, an envelope, no stamp, no return address. Her name in all caps, printed in blocky black ink like someone was daring her to rip it open. She knew it was him before she touched it. There was no other explanation. No one else would drive 2 towns over to find a mailbox that should have been invisible. She stood in the stairwell holding it like it was a snake. The hallway was empty. The buzz of the apartment next door's TV bled through the thin walls, but nobody came out. She wished for once someone would, a witness, a neighbor who'd say later, I saw her standing there, shaking like a leaf, and I asked if she was okay. But no one did. So she opened it alone. Inside was a single slip of paper, torn from a lined notebook. Just 3 words, slanted across the middle, found you again. She wanted to laugh, except the sound curdled in her throat before it could escape. She could picture him writing it. The same messy scrawl he used when he slid notes under her dorm door back then. Back when her mother called him persistent and her father laughed and said, boys like him used to fight duels for girls like you. Like being someone's prize was romantic. Like being afraid was just being dramatic. She crumpled the paper and dropped it in the kitchen trash. Then she changed her mind and dug it out again, smoothing it flat on the counter. Proof. This time, she wasn't going to be the girl who couldn't show them the monster's footprints. She snapped a picture with her phone, her new phone, the one he shouldn't have known about. She didn't send it to her parents. Not yet. Some twisted, lingering hope made her pause. Maybe they hadn't done it. Maybe they hadn't handed over her new address like they'd done the first time she tried to leave. She checked the locks 3 times that night, then sat with her back pressed to the front door. She texted her landlord to ask about the building's camera, the one he'd said was mostly for show. She knew she'd get some half-answer about budget and this neighborhood is safe. That's what everyone says until it's too late. When she finally crawled into bed, the tea on her nightstand was cold again. She wrapped the blanket tight around her, stared at the ceiling, and tried not to think about how he knew where she was. Not yet. Not until she heard her mother's voice on the other end of the line, sweet and thin and so sure she'd say, "You're overreacting, darling. He's not that bad. You just misunderstood him." But for now, it was just her and the letter. Just her and the lock that suddenly felt so breakable. She closed her eyes, already tasting the bitterness of what she'd have to do next, ask the people who should have protected her why they'd handed her fear right back to the person who'd wrapped it up in an envelope, neat as a bow. She sat on the edge of her couch for a full hour, the slip of paper spread out on the coffee table in front of her like some grotesque centerpiece she couldn't look away from. She'd scrolled through every worst-case scenario in her mind. Maybe he'd hired someone, maybe he'd followed her, maybe he'd broken into the leasing office. But the sick, gnawing feeling in her gut kept circling back to the same place. The same 2 voices. The same door she'd left cracked open when she should have slammed it shut. Her mother picked up on the 3rd ring. Same gentle tone she used when she asked about recipes or holiday plans, the warmth that always made her doubt herself, made her wonder if maybe she was the problem. "Honey, are you settling in? I told you that building looked nice. I bet it's so much quieter than the old place." She didn't say hello. She didn't ask about the weather or the curtains she still hadn't hung. She went straight for it, because sometimes you have to rip your own Band-Aid off before someone else does it for you. Mom. Did you tell him where I moved? There was a pause. Just a heartbeat, but enough to hear the lie being stitched together on the other end. Her mother's voice came back sugar-sweet, but brittle. Who, sweetheart? You mean Ethan? Oh, darling, he's just worried about you. He's been calling so much, you know. He said he couldn't get through, and he sounded so concerned. We just thought. She felt her pulse spike, a cold rush up the back of her neck like a warning. You thought what, Mom? That you'd just give him my address? That you'd tell him exactly where to find me? Her mother sighed, that long, theatrical exhale that had followed every argument since she was 12 years old and started saying no to things that didn't feel right. You're always so dramatic about these things. He's not some monster, you know. He cares about you. He always has. You don't see how lonely he's been. She could almost hear her father in the background, the click of his tongue, the grumble of tell her she needs to stop making such a fuss. She does this every time. It was the same script they'd handed her since the first time she'd come to them, eyes wide, voice trembling, telling them about the notes on her windshield, the gifts that kept showing up when she asked him to stop. It's not love, she said, her voice so calm it surprised her. He's stalking me. You gave him my address. Do you understand that? Another pause. Then her father's voice, faint but sharp, cutting through the speaker. Oh, for God's sake. He's a good kid. You always blow things out of proportion. Maybe if you'd just been a little kinder. That was it. The old wound, ripped open like it never healed. Kinder. Like she owed him her peace. Like it was her fault he waited outside her dorm for hours, that he messaged her friends when she blocked him, that he turned up in places she'd never invited him to. She felt the tears threatening, but she forced them down, her fist clenched tight around the phone. Don't call me dramatic, she said, her voice low and even. You gave him my safe place. You told the one person I needed to hide from exactly where to find me. That's not love. That's not protection. That's betrayal. Her mother's voice cracked, switching to that wounded softness that had kept her tangled up for years. We just worry about you, honey. You push people away. You always do this. She hung up before the echo of it could poison her resolve. She dropped the phone on the table next to the letter, the tiny apartment suddenly too small to hold all that disappointment, all that grief. Outside, a car door slammed, and she jumped, her heart hammering until she realized it was just a neighbor, someone going about their night without a clue about the war she was fighting alone inside her chest. She thought moving would save her. Now she knew the real monsters were the ones who told you to smile when you felt your skin crawling, who called you overreacting when you were just trying to survive. After she hung up, she sat in the hush of her tiny apartment, the walls pressing close, the old letter flat on the coffee table like a threat no one else would take seriously. She stared at it until her eyes blurred, and she thought about every moment that led her here, every time her gut told her to run, and their voices told her to sit down and be nice instead. She remembered the first time he showed up uninvited. Sophomore year of college, she'd been sick, curled under 3 blankets, her phone buzzing with his messages. She hadn't replied because her head felt like it was splitting open. She woke up to a soft knock at her dorm door at midnight. He stood there with a grocery bag, full of tea and honey, a brand of soup she'd never even eaten. His eyes were wide and pleading, like he wanted her to praise him for ignoring her no and coming anyway. She'd forced a thank you past the rawness in her throat. Closed the door gently. She told her mother about it on the phone the next day, hoping she'd hear the fear behind her words. But her mother had laughed. Honey, that's sweet. You're so lucky he cares that much. Some girls wish they had a boy like that. He didn't stop. Notes slid under her door every morning, little folded squares with half-finished poems and lines that felt sticky with ownership. She asked him to stop once, twice, 3 times. The third time, He smiled that thin smile that never reached his eyes and said, "You don't mean that. I know you. I know you want this." When she finally told her parents how he'd started waiting outside her part-time job, leaning against the lamp post like her own private shadow, her father said, "He's harmless. If you didn't lead him on, he wouldn't be confused." That word, confused, like her boundaries were a puzzle he couldn't solve, so she should have just handed him the answer key. Even when he left flowers on her car windshield, petals browning in the heat, it was never enough. Her friends whispered that it was creepy, but they didn't see her flinch every time her phone buzzed. They didn't see how she changed her routes home, how she started carrying her keys like tiny weapons between her fingers. She could still see it so clearly, her mother in the kitchen, dabbing her eyes with a tissue when they argued about it over Thanksgiving dinner. "You're blowing this all out of proportion. He bought you presents. He's just lonely. You were always too cold with boys. I'm not surprised he's trying so hard." And her father, carving the turkey with that tight smile, the one that made her feel like she was 13 again, disappointing him just by having feelings that made things uncomfortable. So she'd learned to swallow it. To say thank you when she wanted to scream. To pretend she was flattered instead of afraid. To convince herself that maybe they were right, maybe she was too dramatic, too sensitive, too needy for safety no one else seemed to need. Until now. She snapped out of the memory, fingers digging into the couch cushions so hard her knuckles ached. She looked at the door, the deadbolt she checked 3 times a night, the tiny peephole she stared through if footsteps lingered too long outside. And she felt something shift in her chest, something sharp and bright and final. She'd spent years asking them to stand between her and him, like maybe if they saw the worst of him, they'd love her enough to choose her safety over his feelings. But they'd shown her who they were. The same people who told her he's just worried about you were the ones who'd handed him the map to find her all over again. She wouldn't ask them to understand anymore. She wouldn't beg them to believe her. She'd never get back the years she spent doubting her own fear, but she could decide, right now, that it was hers to trust, and hers alone. And she did. The next morning, she stood in front of the mirror in her cramped bathroom and tried to see herself the way they did, the girl who was always too sensitive, too dramatic, making things worse. She dabbed concealer under her eyes, but it couldn't cover the way her fear looked when it settled into the hollows of her face. She didn't want to see fear there anymore. She wanted to see the version of herself that no one had given her permission to become, the girl who wasn't polite about staying alive. So she gathered the letter, the photo of the envelope, the screenshots of the messages he'd sent back then, the ones she'd saved even when her mother called them sweet. She tucked everything into a battered file folder, the edges frayed from the years she'd carried it like an invisible shield no one wanted to look at. When she stepped into the tiny local precinct, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant made her stomach flip. A young officer behind the counter looked up, eyes tired but kind, like he'd already seen too much for a Tuesday morning. She thought he'd wave her away, tell her there was nothing they could do, that she should just block him like her parents always said. Instead, he listened. Really listened. He flipped through her file, nodding slowly, his pen tapping against the scuffed metal desk. He asked if she felt safe staying in her apartment that night, if she had anyone to call. She almost laughed, the word anyone felt like a joke. She realized she did have someone, though, herself. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked, voice gentle, like he was handing her a key she didn't know she could ask for. "Yes," she said, and her throat burned from the simple truth of it. "I want to file a restraining order. I want this on record." She signed the forms, her pen shaking in her hand, each letter scratching away years of being told she was imagining it. When he asked if her family would cooperate if they needed to confirm details, she paused. She pictured her mother, twisting her wedding band around her finger while saying, "It's just a misunderstanding." She pictured her father, arms crossed, sighing that she always blows things out of proportion. "No," she said finally. I'll handle it myself." When she walked out of the station, the sun hit her like she'd been underground for years. She stopped by the hardware store on the way home, new locks, a door brace, a cheap camera she could tape up near the peephole. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She paid for everything in cash, her fingers trembling when she counted out the bills. She thought of her father's voice when she was younger, saying, "You're so cautious. You make people uncomfortable when you're so suspicious." And she felt the first flicker of pride. Maybe being cautious was her superpower. Maybe suspicion was how you survived when the people you trusted handed out your secrets like party favors. Back at her apartment, she changed the locks herself, YouTube video paused and replayed a dozen times, sweat beading on her forehead as she tightened the last screw. She saved the old lock, tucked it under her sink like a fossil from a life she was done living. Then she taped the restraining order number to her fridge, so she'd see it every morning, a reminder that she'd said no. And no meant no, even if no one else thought it did. When her phone buzzed that night, her mother's name on the screen, her father's voice leaving another voicemail that said she was being cruel, punishing them for no reason, she didn't pick up. She didn't owe them softness anymore. She sat by her window instead, watching the streetlight flicker, the camera's tiny green light blinking steady above the door. For the first time in years, she felt the pulse of her own power, small, steady, growing. She couldn't erase what they'd done. But she could make one promise to herself: he'd have to go through her now to get close again. And so would they. It didn't take long for her silence to make them angry. That was always how it went. The moment she stopped explaining, stopped smoothing things over so they didn't have to feel guilty, their worry turned sharp and petty, like a paper cut she kept pressing against. They called 3 times in 2 days. Left voicemails that twisted everything into knots. "He's worried about you," her mother sniffled into the phone. "We're worried about you. You've always been so ungrateful. He just wants you to see reason." Her father's voice followed, harder, clipped like a blade. "You think you're so clever with your lawyers and your police reports. You'll come running back when you need help. You always do." But she didn't call back. She let their words pile up like dead leaves on the porch of a house she'd never live in again. And when they showed up, because of course they did, she was ready. She saw their car idling at the curb when she came home from the grocery store, a single paper bag hugged to her chest. Her mother's silhouette in the passenger seat, head turned toward the window, waiting for her to appear. The sight made her stomach twist, but there was no more fear in it. Just the familiar ache that said, "This is who they are. Believe it." They didn't even wait for her to get inside. Her father's door swung open the moment she stepped onto the walkway, the bag still balanced against her hip. "We need to talk," he barked, like he still believed his voice could crack her open, spill her guts right there on the concrete so he could rearrange them the way he liked. She kept her keys in her hand. She didn't run, didn't flinch. She just set the grocery bag down on the step and turned to face them both. Her mother hovered behind him, arms folded across her chest, eyes red-rimmed but dry. Always the performance, fragile when it suited her, cold when it didn't. "What is there to talk about?" she said, voice calm, even though her pulse thudded so loud she could taste it at the back of her tongue. Her father spread his hands like he was trying to catch a lie before it could escape. "You've made this so much worse than it needed to be. You called the police on that boy who has always cared about you. You embarrassed us. You made us look like we don't care about our own daughter. Do you know what people are saying about us?" That was it, then. The real wound. Not her fear. Not the letter she'd sent them a photo of and never heard back about. Just the gossip. The shame. She laughed once, sharp, like glass cracking underfoot. "Do you hear yourself? He's not a boy. He's a stalker. He's dangerous. You gave him my address. You knew what he did before and you did it anyway." Her mother's mouth trembled. She reached out, a hand fluttering in the empty space between them. "Sweetheart, we just didn't want him to think you hated him. You can be so cold sometimes. You push people away when they love you. We just wanted you to see. Stop, she said. One word, but it dropped like a stone. Her mother's voice died in her throat. Her father's jaw clenched. You don't get to call that love. You don't get to call it protection. You don't get to stand here and act like I did this to you. You chose him. Again. Over me. You chose him when you gave him the first note and told me I was overreacting. You chose him when you gave him my address and told him I'd come around. You chose him every time you called me dramatic instead of calling him what he is. The wind tugged at her hair. She thought she might cry, but the tears didn't come. They'd dried up somewhere between the hardware store aisle and the police station lobby. Now there was just this, her voice, steady in the hollow of her chest, a truth she'd waited too long to say. You don't get to stand on my porch and tell me I'm ungrateful for saving myself. Her father sputtered something about, after all we've done for you, but she was already picking up her groceries, keys tight in her fist. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and let the lock slide home with a quiet click that sounded more final than any goodbye. They could stand there all afternoon if they wanted. They could talk about her to the neighbors, call her selfish, call her cruel. She didn't care. They'd given her away like an address scribbled on a scrap of paper, but this lock was hers now. And no one was getting through it again. The day after she closed the door in their faces, the world felt too quiet. She half expected to wake up to the sound of pounding on her door, her father's voice booming through the hall like when she was a kid and forgot to mow the lawn. But the only sound was the whir of her small box fan in the window and the soft hum of her cheap security camera blinking its tiny green eye above the door. She made coffee, the good kind this time, not the bitter stuff she used to buy when she thought being cheap was how you proved you didn't need anyone. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, the letter from him tucked away in a folder in the cabinet, the restraining order taped to the fridge like a shield she didn't have to hold in her hands anymore. They called again, of course. The first voicemail was her mother, voice thick with tears that sounded too rehearsed now to fool her. Honey, I didn't sleep all night. We just want you to come home. You're being so unfair. You know he means well, we all do. Why can't you just come talk to us? We're family. She didn't listen to the second voicemail. Or the third. Or the text that came after, her father's clipped words echoing that same threat he'd wielded since she was old enough to talk back, don't come crying to us when you realize what you've done. But that was just it, for once, she wasn't crying. Not for them. Not for him. Not for the version of herself that still ached for their comfort. She was done asking for a hug she knew would always come with a knife tucked just under the soft cotton of their words. In the afternoons, she'd walk down her block with her keys wedged tight between her fingers, her eyes scanning every car that crawled past. She knew some people would call her paranoid. She let them. Paranoia had kept her alive this long, it would carry her further than pretending nothing was wrong ever had. The neighbor in 2B, a middle-aged woman who baked too much bread and offered it to everyone on their floor, asked once, "Are you all right, hon? You look so tired." She almost laughed. Tired was the price she'd pay for this safety. It was worth every sleepless night. She started a new list, taped to her fridge next to the order, passwords to change, names to block, utilities to transfer to her own name so there were no gaps where someone could slip through. Little things, mundane things, but each one felt like a brick she was laying around her peace. Sometimes she'd find herself staring at the door for whole minutes, as if she expected the knob to rattle, his voice to snake through the wood, her father's footsteps behind him saying, "You need to hear him out." But the door stayed closed. The camera's green light stayed steady. She was the only one with the key now. At night, she'd sit at her tiny window and listen to the hum of the city. No family voices bleeding through the walls. No mother telling her to forgive. No father rolling his eyes when she cried. Just her, the creak of her old chair, the warmth of her own arms wrapped around herself like an oath. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like. Maybe he'd try again, people like him rarely went quietly. Maybe her parents would send letters the way he used to, words scribbled in circles until they bled together like a bruise. But she had her own pen now. Her own locks. Her own silence. She didn't owe them an open door. She didn't owe them her fear. She owed herself the chance to be alone, not lonely, but alone in the way that meant free. When she finally turned out the light, she whispered a promise into the dark: no more addresses. No more explanations. Just me, safe, inside my own skin. And this time, there was no one left to call her dramatic for wanting exactly that.